Hello, my name is Rachel, and today I'm going to be doing my November and December wrap-up from the last 2 months of 2016. So first up in November, I read a book that I won on Goodreads, and that was called Graveyard by Ed and Lorraine Warren, and these are famous paranormal investigators, and these were just a couple of stories basically from their paranormal investigating that centered around ghost or some sort of supernatural happening in graveyards around the country, around haunted graveyards. And while this wasn't my favorite book, it was pretty interesting to read. Obviously, I did try to read it right around Halloween, and I read it with my mom. I gave this one 2.5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. Next up, I read the finale of the 5th Wave series, which was called The Last Star by Rick Yancey. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. I think that the 5th Wave book was my favorite one in the series, and I think this one was probably, I don't know, I wouldn't say it was much worse than the second one, but it wasn't that much better either, so it's probably tied with the second one, which was called The Infinite Sea, and I don't know, I think the series did kind of get a little less interesting as it went on, and of course I really was heartbroken by the finale, but I feel like that happens most of the time. And if you're unfamiliar, The 5th Wave, you should definitely check it out. I really enjoyed the first book in the series. It follows a girl who believes she's the last human left on Earth after an alien takeover invasion. It's kind of like The Walking Dead, but with teenagers and aliens. That's always my pitch. And again, I finished the series. I'm glad I read all 3 books, but I do still think the first book was the strongest in the series for me. Next up, I read Roommates by Tara Brown. I actually listened to this one as an audiobook, and I picked this up because of the cover. It had an adorable cover, and I wanted something just kind of quick and easy and light to read after finishing up The Last Star. So I picked this one up, and I really just didn't like it that much. I thought the characters were just unrealistic, and I thought it was just kind of awkward at some points, and it was light and easy to read, but it just wasn't as enjoyable as I was hoping it would be, so I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read How to Move to Canada by Andre DeBrock, and this was right around the election time, and no, I'm not threatening to move to Canada, but it was kind of funny, and again, I was hoping it would be lighthearted, and it was. There was actually some really valid information in there, which I wasn't expecting, but I always joke about moving to Canada because I'm obsessed with hockey, so I just thought this was really funny to read, and it was pretty enjoyable. I loved the elements of this book. There were like little puzzles, like almost like information checks at the end of each little chapter. And like I said, I actually felt like there was a lot more information than what I was expecting, and it was funny along the way. So I really enjoyed this read. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I read in November was for my student book club at the high school that I work with, and that was Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children by Ransom Riggs. I had not read this book yet, so I was really excited to read it with the kids because it had been on my TBR forever, and I was kind of surprised. It was not what I was expecting it to be at all. One of the things that was brought up in our book club discussion was the original cover, I think, was a little bit misleading. It seemed a little bit more like spooky and like horror based in genre than so fantastical as it was. And I'm sure you know what this is about. It is about a home for all these peculiar children that have very interesting abilities, and I did not like this as much as I was kind of hoping to. I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. It was worth the read, but I'm not as excited to finish the series as I was before. However, I would like to point out, if you liked the element of the kind of creepy pictures involved in this, you should definitely check out the Asylum series by Madeline Roux, R-O-U-X, and you should definitely check out the Shadow House series by Dan Pablocki. Both of these are a lot more what I was expecting this book to be, and they use those kind of found and altered photos to amp up the creep level, the creepy factor in all of their books, so definitely give those a check. The first book that I read in December was A Torch Against the Night by Sava Tahir. This is the sequel to An Ember in the Ashes, which was probably my favorite read of 2016. So good, in fact, that I actually read it twice in 2016. And I was really worried about this one because I liked An Ember in the Ashes so much. I just thought there was no way the sequel was going to be as good. And although I will say I think I still liked An Ember in the Ashes a little bit better, I gave this one a 5 out of 5. It was awesome in like just a totally different way, and I just love this environment. I recommended An Ember in the Ashes to one of my students this year, and he's read both of these, and we just love discussing it, and we just absolutely cannot wait for the third book in the series to come out. But it was amazing. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. So good, 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read a book that was a little bit out of my wheelhouse. I heard it recommended on a podcast, and I thought I'd give it a try, and that's kind of one of my goals for 2017 is to read more books out of my typical comfort zone. I think I kind of get into a zone, and that's all I really read. And while that's fine, like to read books in my comfort zone, I would like to branch out a little bit more. So I started with this one. It was called The Man in My Basement by Walter Mosley. And this is basically the story of this black man who is kind of down on his luck, and this rich white man shows up at his door and offers him a ton of money if he allows him to live in a cage in his basement for a set amount of time. And of course, the black man who owns the home is a little bit worried, like, what is this going to look like? What does this mean? What is happening here? Is this guy crazy? But because he's down on his luck, he decides he needs the money and allows it to happen. And we see the relationship of these two and figure out what the man is really doing living in this guy's basement. And it was very interesting because, like I said, it was totally out of my element, and I'm glad I read it, but it just wasn't like a story that I super enjoyed. I ended up giving it 2.5 out of 5 stars, but it was kind of interesting to try something new. Next, I read a book that I got an advanced copy of from NetGalley, and that was The 100 Lies of Lizzie Lovett by Chelsea Sidoti. I discussed this one a little bit in my new release video for January 3rd because it just came out. I thought this was okay. Again, not kind of what I was expecting. This is the story of a girl who doesn't really fit in at her high school, and then a recent graduate of that high school goes missing and is kind of presumed dead, and the girl, the main character, pretty much takes over her life. She gets her job and starts like hanging out with her boyfriend, and it's just really odd. And I love young adult murder mysteries for some reason. They're always very interesting to me, but this one again was not quite what I was expecting. It took some weird turns, and I had a few issues, which again I discussed more in my January 3rd new release video. So I ended up giving it a 3.5 out of 5 stars, but I am glad that I got to read it because it was supposed to be one of the big releases of the year. I saw this everywhere, so I was glad to give it a read. Next up, I joined a couple of readathons in December because I really wanted to hit 100 books towards the end of the year, and I did manage to meet that goal, but I've read several shorter books for Cramathon, and then I took place in Merry Bookmas, and I got all of my reading done. So the rest of these are all part of one marathon read or the other. The first one was a very short book, but it was really good, and it was called We Should All Be Feminists by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and I loved it. This was originally a speech she gave. I think it might have been a TED Talk, but it's just awesome about how we view feminists and why we should all be feminist. And it was just so good and inspiring, and I'm really looking forward to reading more by this author. I think she's got a great voice, and I obviously gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Miss Marble Volume 5. I think this one was called Super Famous by G. Willow Wilson, and I don't really get into the superhero stuff. Like, I just can't follow it. It's not really that interesting to me, but I picked up Miss Marble because I'd seen it recommended, and I just absolutely love the first cover, and it's one of my favorite comics. I read it every time it comes out, and I was a little bit worried to continue on because Volume 4 kind of was a bummer for me, and I'm thinking, I hope this is not indicative of how the series is going to continue, but I think it really picked way back up in Volume 5. I really enjoyed Volume 5, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read another graphic novel that I heard recommended on a podcast, and that was A Brief History of Everyday Objects, and that is by Andy Warner. Basically, he took everyday items such as like kitty litter and ice cream cones and did a double-page spread, graphic novel-esque approach to how this object came into being, and they were all very interesting. I love that it had the same format for each object and it was all the same length, so no particular object seemed to be like a daunting amount of information, but it was very interesting, and I'm looking forward to buying this book for the high school that I work with because I think the kids are going to eat this book up, and I highly recommend it. It was a very entertaining read. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read 365 Days of Wonder by R.J. Palacio. This is basically just a collection of awesome quotes based off of an assignment that the fictional teacher from Wonder gave the students. So it's kind of weird because it really does seem like it's just really weird because it's based off a fictional character, but the way the book is laid out, it seems real, like to the point that I looked up to make sure I was actually reading what I thought I was reading. But the teacher from the book Wonder had given them assignments about famous quotes, and they discussed the meanings and how they can incorporate them into their lives. And then over the summer, he asked them to mail their favorite quotes and inspirational sayings to him, and that's kind of what the book revolves around. There's some essays by the teacher himself regarding the students from Wonder and the main characters, but then it's mostly just a collection of these inspirational quotes. And I love this. I thought it was awesome. It was very uplifting, and I love quotes, so it was just awesome. I bookmarked several quotes that I would like to write down. I think I'm going to try to make like a quote journal or something. I'm not sure, but I marked several that I want to include in such a journal should I start one soon. And I ended up giving this one a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, we were getting close to Christmas, so I picked up A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. It was perfect to read this year because I had seen a live play version of it. I had gone to like a live reenactment / discussion of it, and I realized I had never actually read the original work, so I wanted to get to that this year. So I listened to it as an audiobook because who read it? Tim Curry was the reader, and it was really awesome. I really enjoyed reading it, and I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, again, because it was short, I picked up 7 Brief Lessons on Physics by Carlo Rovelli, and I enjoyed this book so much more than I thought. It was so entertaining because I'm not somebody who's really interested in science. I mean, I guess I should be because, you know, it's all around us, but I just never really got into it. I never really understood it, but the writing in this was enough to make me feel smart, but I could still understand it, if that makes sense. So I really enjoyed this one. It was just like 7 key topics in physics and just breaking down how they relate to each other and how it relates to your world and why it's such a big deal. And I thought it was amazing. There were several times where I was reading it and I would just reread the same statement over and over and just put the book down and just think, wow, like, let me think about this for a minute. It just blew my mind. It was awesome. I am so excited. I think there's supposed to be a new Carlo Rovelli book coming out this year, and I am so going to be on it because I really enjoyed this one. I ended up giving it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, for the December book for my high school book club, we read Dash and Lily's Book of Dares by Rachel Cohn and David Levithan, and I did not like this one as much as I was hoping. I love the premise. The premise is that Lily creates this book of challenges and hides it on her favorite shelf in the Strand bookstore in New York, and then Dash stumbles upon it and starts participating in the challenges, and then creates challenges back to Lily, and they exchange it back and forth and do challenges all over New York around Christmas time, and that just sounds like the most wonderful thing I've ever heard. But I, as well as all of the members of my book club, agree that the characters for us just ruined it. Like, they're both very pretentious and not relatable and not realistic, and I love the plot, didn't like the characters. So I gave it 2.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, in the car on a road trip over Christmas break, I listened to Beezus and Ramona by Beverly Cleary. I have decided that I would really like to go back and read all the Ramona books because I really, really enjoyed them when I was little, but I can't really remember too much about them. So since this was the first one, I decided to go ahead and jump in and start with this one since it was short while I was trying to reach my 100 books, and I enjoyed it. It wasn't as good as I remember it being, if that makes sense, because I feel like most children's books aren't, but I did enjoy the characters and definitely still plan to continue to read on, but we'll see how it goes from there. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Next up was another graphic novel, and it was called Moon Cop by Tom Gauld. This was another one that I heard recommended via a podcast and decided to pick it up, and I thought this was adorable. I really, really enjoyed this one. This centers around exactly what it says, a moon cop. Civilization has taken up on the moon, and because of this, they need some cops there, so they send this guy to be a cop up at the moon. But now things have started to reverse. It's several years after it's been colonized, and people have gradually moved back to planet Earth. And in the book, you see several people leaving too, and now he's the only cop left on the moon. And it's just, I really, really enjoyed this one. I thought the illustrations were great. I thought the whole story was wonderful. I really enjoyed this one. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And lastly, for 2016, the last book that I read for the year and the month was You Can't Hide, Book 2 of the Shadow House series by Dan Pawlowski. Dan Pawlowski came to our school earlier this fall and promoted Shadow House Book 1, The Gathering. So I feel very invested in this series. So as soon as I found out that the second book was coming out in December, I literally ran like that day to Barnes & Noble and picked it up, and I read it, I think, in like a day or two because they're really short. They're meant for like middle grade. And I enjoyed this one. I think I actually like this one better than the first. The first book felt like a lot of build up. Like it was character and setting and just all of this development. I didn't feel like, even though a lot happened, it just felt like you needed more, and I think the more came with this book. So I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, and I will definitely continue on with this series. Basically, the whole idea of the series is that several kids are lured to this kind of creepy house under different pretenses. Like I think 2 of them think it's like a specialized school. One of them thinks that a distant relative owns it, and she's an orphan, so she's hoping to be, adopted / just live with this family member. And 2 of them think that they're going to be involved in some sort of reality show or movie or something. So they're all lured there under different pretenses, and then once they get into the house, all the doors lock and the ghosts come out to play. So it is very fun to read. It is interesting, and I think my students really, really liked it, especially after they got to meet Dan Pawlowski. And yeah, so I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, and that was my final read for 2016. So those are all the books that I have for you today. Thank you for watching, and let me know down below what was your favorite book of 2016. I'd love to know. And I will see you again soon with another video. Bye for now.